Welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Noam Pianco, and I'm the director of the UW's Stroum Center for Jewish Studies, and I hold the Samuel N. Stroum Chair in Jewish Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies. And I just want to welcome all of you to our annual Stroum Lecture. Before we move forward in our program, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Washington sits on the land of the Coast Salish people, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and the bands of the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Since 1975, the Stroum Lectures have brought high-profile scholars to Seattle each year to give engaging public lectures to the campus and community audiences. These luminaries have included Irving Howe, Dara Horn, Ruth Behar, and Robert Alter. It has also resulted in a series of books published by UW Press that includes classics such as Zachor by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, my own teacher, Paula Hyman, Zichron Levracha, Zachor, Gender and Assimilation in Modern Jewish History, and Nita Norwich's Writing in Tongues, Translating Yiddish in the 20th Century. And we are really thrilled to be able to add Dr. Neis to these ranks. This event, like all the events at the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies, is made possible by the generous support of the community of donors that we are fortunate to have, and many of our donors are in the audience, so I would just like to thank you for your generosity. I'd also like to thank our amazing staff who work tirelessly to bring events like this one and support our academic programming. Thanks in particular today to Aliyah Vinacour, Gina Wardell, who are the Division III staff for the Jackson School and are responsible for all of our events and programming. I'd like to invite up my colleague, Dr. Gila Kletenik, who will introduce our speaker. Dr. Kletenik is a 2024-26 Stroum Center for Jewish Studies Hazel D. Cole Fellow in Jewish Studies. Her research explores Jewish philosophy from the medieval through modern period. Some of you may have been lucky enough to be here to hear Dr. Kletenik's book talk earlier this year. She recently published a really amazing book called Sovereignty Disrupted, Spinoza and the Disparity of Reality. And there's been a lot of excellent review and conversation about that book. And Gila also co-hosts a podcast, actually, with tonight's speaker. So they have worked together in the past. It's called Adrabah, and they explore big questions through a diverse range of Jewish texts, ideas, and cultures. So I encourage you all to check that out after the lecture. Gila.
Thank you, Noam, and good evening. It's so lovely to see so many familiar faces and some new faces here from on campus and beyond. 46 years ago, Professor Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi opened his Stroum Lectures by identifying the complex relation of Jews to their own past and the place of the historian within that relationship. This evening and throughout this week, we have the distinct privilege of studying together with Professor Rafael Neis, another trailblazing historian. Like Yerushalmi, Professor Neis's scholarship implicitly wrestles with this conundrum, but enacts its own particular negotiation. Professor Neis is not just an historian, and the historiography they do is not of the conventional variety. This is partly due to their uncommon training. In addition to holding a PhD in Jewish Studies from Harvard University, Neis also has a law degree from the London School of Economics and studied painting at the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design at Hebrew University. Professor Yerushalmi concluded his Stroum Lectures by remarking, quote, "The very ability to conceive a time when men and women think differently than we, be it in the future or in the past, is the fruit of that historical consciousness which is ours in the present." This truly captures what animates Professor Neis's scholarship and how it challenges us to rethink what we thought we knew. Their work consistently displays the possibilities unleashed when we don't overdetermine the meaning of a text or artifact or artwork, when we tarry with the unfamiliar, allowing it to speak to us in all of its uncanniness in our moment. Yet not to validate what we already thought, nor to consolidate what we already knew, but to challenge precisely what we have always taken for granted. Through both the content and form, matter and methodology of their research, writing, and teaching, Professor Neis allows us not only to grasp the messiness of the past with nuance, but in so doing to see ourselves and our shared worlds differently. Professor Neis challenges us to be attuned to that which is other, inviting us to think otherwise. Please join me in welcoming the Jean and Samuel Frankel Chair in Rabbinic Literature at the University of Michigan, Professor Neis.
Hi everyone, I was told to, is this good? Okay, just checking the adjustments. And hopefully you all have a handout that you're welcome to consult while I shuffle some papers. And I'll begin by thanking Aliyah Vinicour, Gina Wardell for just such exquisite logistical and hospitable planning and execution. So thank you so much, and a very warm thank you to Noam Pianco and to Sasha Senderovich and to my humbling colleague, Gila Kletenik, for your welcome, your reception, for inviting me, and for that really amazing introduction, which is setting me up for many a fall, I'm sure. So yes, I'm also extremely grateful that you've come out, 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'm grateful that I'm awake, and I think I'm here. And before I begin, I actually just want to take a minute to acknowledge the devastating killing of a young trans woman, a student at UW, the day before yesterday. And I'm thinking of you, as I imagine you are all impacted by this. Some of you may know the person. This may hit home very hard, especially if you're trans or queer or have trans and queer loved ones. So I really want to hold that in this space, given the timing and the topic of the talk. And it's already such a very difficult time for trans people who've been suffering the multiple effects of being targeted by the government and by politicians really since the 2010s. That's what the data shows. But with particular material vitriol since January 2025. So this event that happened here so locally is, of course, as we know, disproportionately all too common in this historical moment, and by that I mean more than a decade. And it makes me think very hard about how scholarship in the ancient past interacts with the present, which I already do think about. And I'm particularly chastened by the moment and really grateful to be able to present my work in this time and in this place in a time in which many institutions are narrowing academic freedom, banning words and research topics to do with gender and other topics, including critical race, all while proclaiming viewpoint diversity. And so to those of us who care about academic freedom, let us use our voices and all our words now. And those of us who care and value the lives of all people, all genders, regardless of their gender, let us speak up for trans and non-binary people now. I read some of the summaries of the recent climate surveys conducted at this university, which were released in December 2025. I couldn't find any of the specific data, but I've also studied the data at my institution at the University of Michigan, and they the report parallels devastating findings. Trans-spectrum students at UW experience hostile conduct and sexual misconduct and assault at disproportionately higher rate in this institution compared to men and compared to women, often doubling the numbers of women. They experience the highest rates of not having a feeling of belonging here on campus. So I'm just, I'm not trying to be a downer, but it feels to me that the material conditions of the present must inform what it means to be here giving this talk. And now I begin. Have men and women always existed? Trans and non-binary people have always existed. Since the 2010s, this refrain has gathered currency, motivated largely by the onslaught of attacks against trans people. And specifically, this phrase responds to accusations that transness is a recent phenomenon introduced by the woke media or woke academia or cultural Marxists / George Soros, for example. So to state boldly that trans people have always existed is to directly rebut the attacks on present-day trans people's existence. The claim that this claim asks for and has stimulated vital histories. We are learning more about the past and present, examples of people who have existed outside of the genders they were originally assigned, or who were gendered beyond the binary of male and female. But the question I want to pose today goes in the opposite direction. I want to ask whether men and women have always existed. In other words, let us turn the most basic methods of historical inquiry to the assumed default of men and women. Asking the question this way reverses the burden of proof. Instead of finding exceptions to what is supposedly the rule of binary sex gender, we ask, has this rule always been the case? Now, I'm certainly not the first to pose the question this way, but I wish to do so in a sustained or as a sustained method for reading ancient historical sources, including ancient Jewish and other sources. So let us explore this evening the seemingly obvious presumption that men and women and boys and girls are the default in our archive. Let's question that. So what would it mean to question this seeming obviousness even beyond the supposed academic consensus that most academics agree about, or at least recite, that gender, at the very least in contrast to something called sex, academics will say gender is historically and culturally variable. But this is usually, time and again, taken to mean that there are different ways of being men and women. And this, I would argue, still leaves intact the basic premise of men and women as defaults, even as it sometimes kindly allows minoritized, individualized exceptions to the rule. So what would be the more accurate title of this talk? In a way I'm saying, but have men and women always existed? The accurate title is, We Have Never Been Cis, the Talmud Before Gender. So here's the path we're going to take. We'll start with a brief introduction, a few minutes, for a review of the terms sex and gender. That's all it should take. Then I'll suggest a tentative framework for thinking rabbinic sex gender as a matrix. After that, we'll move into a case study from the Babylonian Talmud. Okay? So let's just start with a brief foray through the concepts of sex and gender, which is these are the terms of art that scholars, academics, and increasingly people outside of the specialized trade we like to call academia use these concepts. And the basic premise is that scholars will often distinguish between sex and gender in the following ways. They will describe sex as a biological matter to be determined by science, versus gender, which they'll see as a cultural, social, political, and even personal phenomenon. As scientific fact, sex is understood to be stable and fixed, unlike gender, which can vary across time and place, or even within a particular time and place. This could translate as studies of how men and masculinity changed in the Ancien Régime, or how the experience of enslaved women changed from, say, the early Roman Empire to the Byzantine Empire. But almost always, as I've said, sex is understood to be binary in this model. The science or biology-inflected words male and female are sometimes even used to describe this facticity. So female scholars, right? That is a sciencey word, rather than, feminine scholars, for example, or women scholars. Gender is usually understood to pertain to its underlying sex, So the questions often concern women's femininity and, surprise, surprise, men's masculinity, with gender transgression or queerness attributed, to some to supposed boundary crossings or non-dominant people or groups. Gender, in other words, is also binary, even when it doesn't align, it's a very fashionable word, align with sex. There are exceptions. Perhaps the gender transgressors just mentioned are among them. And the existence of, this is just to sort of represent the binary, the existence of intersex, trans, and non-binary people challenge both the distinction between sex as science and gender as culture, but also the male-female binaries within both sex and gender, right? So within sex, it's male and female. Within gender, it's masc and femme, or masculine and feminine. So what we end up with is a problematic, we end up with problematic and downright phobic or incorrect language when we try to slot people like intersex folks or trans and non-binary people into a structure that doesn't fit. Like, where do you put trans people exactly in this structure, right? You have these terms that are rightly seen as problematic, like a female man, to describe a trans man, and why would you describe a trans man who's rampant with testosterone as female, right? It doesn't even make sense from a sort of sciencey, sex-based perspective. So it doesn't fit. But even beyond this, scientists have recognized that the distinction between sex and gender is artificial, and that sex itself is actually difficult to discern and often doesn't fit into one or two options for many people, not just the special few who are designated exceptions, right? Who we must include, thank you so much. This is partly because there are multiple ways to assign sex. Different scientists use different approaches, often inconsistently. This is really a problem that impacts research at a basic level. So Cell, for example, the kind of journal in biology, has a caveat noting that this is a problem in all research that presumes that sex is a constant and that everything else is the variable. So you've probably heard this 1,000 times. So-called biological sex is based on a complex combination of different, let's say, vectors, chromosomes, gonads, hormones, internal and external anatomy. And it is what Sandy Stone describes as a cluster concept. But there is great diversity and variation within each of these vectors, and the decision to assimilate some kinds of variation within two choices, or to exclude others and say this is intersex, this is right, this is not, is inconsistent, and it's incoherent, and it has been from the get-go. So this is sort of my many people is to say that increasingly scientific models are questioning or sort of showing that on this scale, suddenly the number of intersex people goes up well beyond the 1% to a much higher number, because it depends how you assess and sign sex. And I really recommend on the bibliography Beans Veloci's recent book, which shows how the decisions scientists made in the 50s, that is last century, and onward, about how to include and exclude variation, were racialized often and bound up with eugenic thinking. And Veloci explains how the political and social conditions that led to the decision, a human-made decision, in the 50s, largely in the wake of John Money, to siphon off sex as the scientific domain and gender as the cultural historian's domain, was a historical decision made for very specific reasons, and those who made it recognized its inadequacy. That is, John Money himself said, well, we're going to use this binary system for sex, but it doesn't always really work that way. And of course, scientists and biologists keep producing substantial evidence for how many exceptions the rule produces. And the question is, in a kind of Kuhnian, right, Thomas Kuhn talked about scientific paradigms, how many exceptions does it take before we say the rule isn't working? And of course, I want to point out that ways of being and knowledge produced outside the global north have long questioned the limitation of these not even century-old recent European ideas about human variation. So if I want to be tendentious, I would say men and women have never existed, or only recently. It's a recent phase. I'm sure that they'll get over it soon. They have so many wonderful affirmations in the world, though. We must cut those services. So I prefer to use the term sex gender. Oh, that slide didn't work. Okay. I prefer to use the term, not sex and not gender, but sex gender, because I want to sort of point out that sex itself is cultural, right? The separation between sex and gender is a cultural of human making, and it is a fraught one. And like other classifications, like species, right? Some dude, Linnaeus, decides, I'm going to group animals into families and kingdoms. I'm going to call myself the second Adam. And it's a convention, right? Most biologists, most zoologists are not species realists. That is, they acknowledge that the idea of species, of classification, is a human conceit. It is at best a pragmatic convenience. Okay, so I'm going to give you a different definition of gender and sex, and then I think we're done with this very simple and not fraught topic. What is sex? So I define sex as the decision to inconsistently prioritize certain variables among multiple variables and to place them into one or two categories. And often, sex entails the convention that its assignment is neutral or objective in the domain of biology and science. That's my deliberately circular definition of sex. And what is gender? You may wonder. Gender is the belief that gender is something separate from sex, where sex is biological and gender is a matter of culture, society, history, and identity. It's also of recent vintage. Now, for the rest of the talk, we're going to visit with a cultural formation that thinks differently about sex gender. And that's, of course, with the rabbis of late antiquity. Whoopsie, backwards. Oh yes, this is just, look at this beautiful effect, look. Well, whoopsie, gender, sex, look, boom, sex, gender. And the sound effects are free. Okay, so now a couple of minutes, a foray, a premise. I'm going to suggest, as a hypothesis, that rabbinic sex gender, and secretly all gender, is a matrix, thus dating myself. I don't mean that in a narcissistic sense. Oh my gosh, Sasha, you're an amazing member of the audience. And I'm so glad this is being filmed. Okay, so we're going to look at a popular way of approaching gender, which is an approach I call the menu approach. It's even appeared in the New York Times to counter the 27 transphobic pieces that the New York Times likes to host because of diversity of thought. So here are some of the sex genders. There's man, there's woman, there's male, there's female, there's a person called the androgynous person, whom we're going to look a little bit more into. There's somebody that the rabbis, this is, by the way, all derived from the 3rd century redacted text known as the Mishnah, which was redacted in the Roman Galilee. You have androgynous, we'll talk about these people, somebody called a tumtum, whose sex gender is unknown, a saris, basically that's the same term, seems to be potentially etymologically as the term eunuch, who's in a sense, I'm putting M for masculine, somebody who's assigned perhaps as male at birth, which is of course completely anachronistic thing to say. And the rabbis actually distinguish, and the sort of menu generators who are trying to show, look, there've always been more than two sexes. The rabbis actually do distinguish between somebody who's a born saris, a born eunuch, and someone who's later in life, or a human-made saris, okay? And then there's actually somebody who's, in a sense, does not become a woman, an ailonit, which I'm a huge fan of the most literal translation possible. It's ailonit is like a little ram, so sort of like a ram-lamb. And of course, yes, the later rabbis do all kinds of fun things because the word for ram is dachar, which is also the word for penis. So it also kind of means little dick, which is adorable. This is a scholarly, by the way, this is the finest of philological articles, we'll discuss this. So this approach I call the menu approach, right? It is sometimes done more or less anachronistically, assuming that sort of, in some ways, for example, an androgynous person seems to be somebody who is, let's say, some people would translate it as a kind of man-woman. That's the literal translation of the Greek, the kind of appropriated Greek term, which is already interesting that the rabbis are using a Greek term to refer to this person. And some people will actually say that's an intersex person, and people today find great meaning in this scheme. But that's not the approach I'm going to take as a historian. It's not to sort of criticize it. I'm taking a very different approach. So this is actually a very important source that discusses the androgynous person that I'm translating for convenience as a man-woman, because again, literalism is, I think, very helpful here. An androgynous person has ways they are like, and this is the 3rd century text that's trying to pass out who is an androgynous. Okay. And I'm not going to give you the full text. I'm going to sort of represent it as a sort of Venn diagram. The androgynous person has ways they are like a man, ways they are like a woman, ways they are like men and women, and ways they are like neither men nor women. And what the passage does is it goes on to delineate these different groupings of ways, 4 ways, right, which entail a journey across multiple domains of ritual, kinship, and economics. Very, very few of these ways of being men and women and neither and both have to do with the body, right? There's a mention of genital secretions, there's a brief mention of being postpartum and purity entailments, and that's it. The rest are largely about ritual and status. Now, at the end of the enumeration, we hear from a named rabbi in this passage, this 3rd century passage. Rabbi Yossi says, an androgynous person is a creature unto themselves, biryala atzmo. Thus, potentially Rabbi Yossi says this, or perhaps an anonymous editorial voice. Thus, the sages could not circumscribe him as a man or her as a woman. Okay, so this passage has been seen as the locus classicus of one of the ways in which there are more than 2 sex genders. And so, this is in the menu approach, you have here 3 sex genders and counting, right? There are these other figures that I showed you before with the 6, 7, or 8 genders of the Talmud. But I would argue that that approach fails to really capture the logics of the passage, because the contents of these ways of men, ways of women, being both, being neither, is significant. The passage takes us through multiple dimensions of obligation and entitlement across ritual domains related to purity, like genital discharge, priesthood, like entitlement to sacrifice, kinship, the levirate, right? Your brother dies childless. Do you have to marry his wife, his widow? That's the levirate. Economics, inheritance, for instance. And by kind, I'm using that as a kind of ancient word for species, min. In other words, the scheme thinks about the sort of classification of a person as a human, as a Jewish human, right, or as a convert. Like there are almost like there are other taxonomies within which a person is designated a kind. The key here is that sex gender is just one thread entwined, that's my matrix, in a matrix of ritual obligation and entitlement. Sex gender collaborates with these various vectors I've described. It constitutes and is constituted by these other vectors. It doesn't exist prior to them. That should say not pre-existent, not what it says. One becomes a woman, an androgynous person, a human, a married priest, an enslaved person, a Jew, by doing and being subject to particular entitlements or obligations, and these things can change. So in this respect, sex gender is potentially situational, mutable, and multiple. Even on the menu approach, there are more than 2, and perhaps as many as 5. But my point is that rabbinic sex gender is intersectional. One way of expressing this is to enumerate the many kinds of configurations of sex-gendered ritual obligation and entitlement, which I won't do. But you could make a list of, and I started doing it, and I won't even just harm you by reading this, of the many permutations, kind of terms of art, that could, from this sort of matrix or intersectional view, constitute genders, many of which are mutable and changeable. Okay. But now, what I want to do is take this approach, having grounded ourselves. All this has just been throat clearing. Now we're going to get to the meat, which is a case study. And we're going to look at a particular passage, which is Bava Metzia, I'm abbreviating it here, 84a, a narrative, 2 episodes in a 3-part narrative, we'll only look at 2, about Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And a few words of orientation about the Talmud. We're going to look at the Babylonian Talmud. There are 2. We won't bother about the so-called Yerushalmi or Palestinian Talmud. Sorry. The Babylonian Talmud, also known as the Bavli, consists of a large stratum of Palestinian rabbinic and Mesopotamian or Iraqi. These are all terms of Babylonia, Mesopotamia, right? These are all terms for the same area, which is modern-day Iraq. It consists of a massive stratum of teachings, traditions, stories about and by sages from around the year 70 to around the 6th century. And this is actually, I gave you a little kind of scheme about this on your handout. And then there's a sizable layer in the Babylonian Talmud which is an anonymous editorial layer, which is also responsible for the final output and organization of the Talmud, but often will, using technical Aramaic language, interject and make its organization visible in a certain way, and will ask questions and recontextualize what were clearly earlier blocks of material. We can nerd out about this another time. Okay, so this particular story is situated in the tractate of Bava Metzia, and the protagonists, Rabbi Yochanan and Shimon ben Lakish, are the most cited 2 sages in the Babylonian Talmud. So it's, in a way, I describe this as a hagiography. It's a sacred story. They themselves lived in the Roman Galilee in the 3rd century. But the story seems to be a later story told by their kind of later Babylonian, I don't want to call them descendants, right, but sort of who see them as ancestral, okay? And those storytellers are living, around the 6th century in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. They are living within the context, then, of the Sasanian Empire, okay? I'm sorry that it's very hard to read, and I can see if I can, oh gosh, hold on, I have like older person's eyes, so let me see if I can find, oh man, it's too difficult to see. Okay, I can't find, okay, I can't see this clearly enough, but if I could, I would find Ctesiphon, which is where many of the sages lived, which is not far from modern-day Baghdad, basically. And what's interesting is the Sasanian Persian government had headquarters in that city. So the rabbis lived in a very urban center. And so while historically the Babylonian Talmud has largely been, for completely neutral reasons, read in light of Greek and Roman classics, it's completely random, has nothing to do with, where we are. There's increasing recognition that Iraq was within the context of a Sasanian-Iranian empire, which of course had a lot of interaction with the kind of other superpower, Rome, but also had interaction with Chinese imperial court, the Qin Han court in East Asia, and various, like the Kushano Indian kingdoms of, I guess, late ancient India, and a lot to do with the Caucasus, right? So there's Iran and Iraq are actually maybe almost better understood in an Indo-Iranian or Eurasian world, right? And so the places the rabbis are living, a lot of Jews, Christians, Mandeans, Manichaeans, Zoroastrians, right? Languages, Aramaic is big in Iraq, but so there's you would hear some Greek, some Latin, some Pahlavi, and I probably had another language there that I deleted for some reason. And then here are the cultural contexts that we might think of, which are just starting to be seen as relevant to the study of the Babylonian Talmud. We're not going to have time for all of it today. We're just going to plunge right now into our story. And I have a printout of it, so you're welcome to follow. It starts with Rabbi Yochanan, who in a casual kind of way declares themselves to be the last of the remaining, or the last of the Jerusalem beauties. I am the last of the Jerusalem beauties. And then I'm sort of skipping over the next part of the text. So if you're following along, skip until you get to this passage, because I believe that the part I'm skipping over is clearly an editorial layer. We will revisit it, but not now. We're going to pretend that we have the unedited version. Rabbi Yochanan, having said this about themselves, would sit at the entrance of the ritual bath, saying, when the Israelites, it's Benot Yisrael, come up from ritually immersing, they're ritually immersing after menstruating, and so they're now able to have sex with their spouses, they will gaze at me, so that beautiful children like me will come into being. So just a casual method. Well, what's the mechanism here? We can discuss that at some point. Like, how is that happening? The rabbis said to Yochanan, aren't you afraid of the evil eye? Yochanan replied to them, I come from Joseph's seed, over whom the evil eye does not rule. Okay. And I'm drawing a little bit from a comic that I've yet to publish, which represents this story. What is this thing? What does it mean, I come from Joseph's seed? And the root is zera, which can be seed and semen. It's the same word. And I think it's not a coincidence. Do you see my little semens? Yeah, it's subtle, right? That's why I'm going for that. Okay, and a casual display of a roughly contemporary, either Syrian or Palestinian Christian Bible, which already, if you just look at this, there's something about Joseph. Right, which one is Joseph? I hope you don't know. I hope you want to keep your minds open. But in a certain sense, it's not clear. Okay. So what does it mean to be Joseph's seed? So the Bible describes Joseph, not coincidentally, as being of beautiful form, right? And Joseph was of beautiful form and beautiful appearance. And then the biblical verse goes on to say, and their master's wife cast her eyes. So beautiful appearance attracts a predatory gaze of their enslaver's wife. The rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud are privy to earlier Palestinian rabbinic exegetical traditions that discuss what it was that made Joseph so singular. And so here we have Genesis Rabbah, Midrash Breshit Rabbah, 5th century redacted exegesis on Genesis. Like a warrior, the word is gibor, it's like vir, it's the same root as gever, man or strong, right? Like a warrior or hero. And here's how heroes behave: making up their eyes, curling their hair, and sashaying. I was trying to decide, is toleba akavot, is it sashaying, or the other alternative is wearing high heels? Weirdly, no one else has translated it like this, but it's very clearly, we've got a drag race happening. Declaring, so this is Joseph, I'm beautiful, I am a warrior. I mean, I love that combination. I feel we need that. They, whoever the they is, I don't know, they said to Joseph, if you are a warrior, here is a bear. Get up and jump her. Kofza, it's actually not even jump on her, it's jump her, and it could have the double meaning. So we have a self-aware person declaring their own beauty, starting to see the parallel between this other story. But we have a kind of sadistic narrative that challenges Joseph's multivalent gender, especially the citation of, let's call it masculinity, but I'm actually not sure what masculinity is anymore. I'm so open-minded, right? You know the Churchill phrase. Okay. Elsewhere, the same Midrashic collection describes these same actions of Joseph, putting on eye makeup, having their hair done, and sashaying. And it describes those actions as, it says, Joseph performed the makings of girlhood, oseh ma'aseh na'arut, which is just, it's such a wonderful summation of what gender is. You do the doings of the thing. That's it. That's it. There's no essence here. So there's something about Joseph's gender. Now the rabbis sort of struggle with Joseph's gender because they want there to be some kind of challenge of restraint, right? To be a man to some degree, means to restrain. So we have the biblical narrative. One day, Joseph came into the house to do their work, and there was no man of the house at home. And this is the presage to Potiphar's spouse, Joseph's enslaver, essentially sexually attacking Joseph. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said to do their work. Joseph was going to do their work. Indeed. The point here is that in some ways, those rabbis are trying to redeem Joseph in a certain sense by imputing the possibility that Joseph was in fact going to have sex with his enslaver. But there was no man. They examined themselves and they did not find a man, ish. So there's something interesting happening with the Palestinian midrashic kind of understanding of Joseph's sex gender that has to do with some kind of multivalent, let's call it masculinity, femininity. There's something about beauty, makings of girlhood, something about warrior and its relationship to the word vir or gever. What do scholars do? Here are the words that I've tracked, the recurring words: primping, mincing, prancing, dandy, vain, effeminate, queer. The last, of course, is a little more redemptive, and it is less obviously homo/transphobic. So interestingly, the word effeminate is still used. It's somehow okay to use a word that is expressly stigmatizing, because you're just reporting what the text is doing. You're not collaborating or reinforcing or over-interpreting in any way. You're just neutrally reporting, right? And the word queer is sometimes used in an effort to not, in a way, lean into what is perceived to be a stigmatization of Joseph's gender in the text. What does the Babylonian Talmud tend to do with Joseph's gender? Well, we've seen already that Yochanan cites themselves in the lineage of Joseph. I am the seed of Joseph. I don't need to worry about the evil eye. We'll talk about what that is, because I'm the seed of Joseph. So the Babylonian Talmud preserves a lot of Palestinian teachings about Joseph. It uses Joseph and a particular verse blessing Joseph as an incantation and even physical ritual against the evil eye. So Joseph is in fact not casually invoked by Yochanan. Joseph becomes a thing, you cite Joseph if you're worried about the evil eye. And of course, you partly do so by saying you are the seed of Joseph, which is what Yochanan is doing. So what does it mean to be the seed of Joseph? And here we have an artifact from the Metropolitan Museum, a first century bronze amulet, which if you can see, it has a couple of representations of male genitalia and what is known as the manofika hand gesture, where a thumb or a finger is placed inside a hand. Okay. The Babylonian Talmud also preserves a version of this, which is supposed to be done physically. And this is actually a ritual, right? This is described in ancient sources and is, it's something that people still do. And maybe giving the middle finger to someone is a kind of remnant of that. So if you go to a city and you're new in a city you've never been to and you're worried about the evil eye, what do? You hold the thumb of one's right hand in your left hand and the thumb of the left hand in the right hand. So it's some version of the manofika. And you recite, I, so-and-so, and whatever your name is, I, so-and-so, child of so-and-so, come from the seed of Joseph, over whom the evil eye does not rule, as it says, and you recite a verse that is virtually impossible to translate. I'm going to give a fake translation. Joseph is a fruitful branch by a fountain. It could be read, it's like ole ayin, it could be surpassing or overcoming the eye. We could spend an hour just translating that verse. It could be translated as Joseph is a wild mule. It could be translated as Joseph is a cow's calf. Because Ben Porat Yosef, whatever. It's a very unusual formulation. Okay. So the point is that this, what people think is that this gesture and even the manofika resembles not just a phallus, but vulva. That is a phallus inserted in, or let's just say entangled within or intertwined within vulva. Okay, so it's already an interesting symbol that invokes let's just say, more than one set of genitalia. And here's, by the way, a magnifica found in Roman Palestine in the 4th century in Bet Sha'an. And you can sort of see the symbol. I kind of made a joke earlier that I'm going to do something rude in this talk, but I won't actually do it. I don't really feel the evil eye. Probably I should. But in case, right, I brought my amulet with me. Okay, so let's take all this is like in the manner of simultaneous equations, and know that this reservoir is being cited and triggered when Yochanan sits there and proclaims their own beauty and says that they're going to bring about somehow, their mere presence, being beheld by these women, is going to bring about offspring that are beautiful like them. And they respond to this question of the evil eye, and they say, I come from Joseph's seed. This is the tradition that they are invoking, a multi-sexual Joseph, right? And an incantation slash ritual that invokes vulva and penises that is supposed to fend off the evil eye. So it's not at all loaded. So now we're going to look at that gap, that ellipsis, and we're going to see a really interesting later editorial meditation on what it is about Joseph's beauty. Okay, so we know it's an editorial layer because it slips into a different kind of formulaic technical Aramaic, and this is how it moves. We have Yochanan saying, I'm the loss of the Jerusalem beauties. And then we have the Stum, the anonymous editor, saying, if you want to see, here's a trick, don't try it at home. One who desires to see Rabbi Yochanan's beauty, let them take a silver cup as it emerges from the crucible, fill it with the seeds. By the way, we all have a crucible at home. It's no biggie to get like a freshly, I want to say minted, soldered, smithied, right, goblet, silver goblet. Fill it with the seeds of red pomegranate that you have, and of course, encircle its brim with a crown or chaplet of red roses, and set it in that magical spot between the sun and the shade. The radiance cast from it. This is Rabbi Yochanan's beauty. Okay, so by the way, this is the language usually used for ritual, like what we call magic, right? Recipes for ritual power. Let's use a less tendentious term, not magic. And of course, not everyone is able to see Rabbi Yochanan whilst immersing ritually after menstruating. So this is how, in theory, right, you can try this at home. Should you want to reproduce children like Rabbi Yochanan? I haven't tried it myself. I'm just saying. And I am a practicing artist, I just don't have access to a kiln. But now we have this teaching, and now we have the anonymous voice responding, saying, but this is not so. This is so Babylonian Talmud. This is not so. Because I have a counter-teaching. Okay, listen to it, listen up. Didn't the master say, Rav Kahana's beauty, this is a Babylonian sage, resembles that, me'en shufrei, is like the appearance of the beauty of that of Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu's beauty, I'm just truncating the translation, resembles that of our father Jacob, our patriarch. Our father Jacob's resembles that of Adam, and of course, implicitly, Adam is in the image of what's that dude? Oh, God, right? Rabbi Yochanan is not included. If they're that beautiful, why are they not in this list of beauties that actually goes back to the first human? Are they not human? What's going on? Rabbi Yochanan did not have hidur panim, which could be translated, hidur could mean glory, facial glory. It refers to beard. It could also, hidur, the root hadar can mean glory or glorification, adornment, but it can also mean encircling. So it could be just a technical, it just means hair encircling their face. Okay, so we're just going to return to the story. We just had a brief, because I think of the editorial strata as almost the chorus, right? We had a brief ritual to conjure Rabbi Yochanan's beauty. Then we had Yochanan not being in a mask lineage because they're beardless. And of course, they're like I'm going to call them a Josephine, of Josephine seed. Okay? And so, what I'm showing you here, just a casual depiction of a 3rd century, second half of 3rd century seal found in Iran of a eunuch, somebody who's described as a shabashtan, which is a term related to saris. That is like the head keeper of the king's chamber. right? So eunuchs were often palace officials, originally perhaps working in the women's quarters because they were seen as kind of their sex gender was allowed them to go into women's spaces, like women's quarters, like the ritual bath, where women are immersing completely nude, by the way, right? So Rabbi Yochanan being in a women's ritual space is not a small thing either. Okay. And they are represented when we see them in Sasanian art, including Sasanian art with finds in Iraq, right, near where the rabbis would have been circulating, is they are beardless. Okay. So this is a figure that the rabbis maybe are, I'm not necessarily saying that Rabbi Yochanan is a eunuch, but what I'm saying is that to call someone beardless and sequester them from a patriline of beauties is a sex-gendered category move. And by the way, the rabbis, of course, are heir to a tradition that talks about the simanim, the signs, the semia of the saris, which include having no pubic hair, no beard, soft flesh, basar, which could refer to a soft penis. Maybe this is a mollis, right? Urine and semen don't have the right kinds of, or froth in a different way, then let's call them cis men. And they have a high voice. And the rabbis say whether or not they are a man or a woman is not visible. They cannot be distinguished morphologically, right? Okay, so the story continues with Rabbi Yochanan bathing, this is now episode 2, in the waters of the Jordan. Previously, Rabbi Yochanan was around when women were bathing without clothes on, and most likely, right, when we think of somebody bathing, they're not wearing what I would call a swimming costume and what you would call a bathing suit, right? They didn't have synthetic polyester about their persons at all time in late ancient, this would be, I guess, technically Palestine. Right, and this is relevant because we are also told that Resh Lakish comes by. And Rabbi Yochanan looked like a woman, and this is just a description of what they look like, and I take that very literally and very seriously. Resh Lakish goes on to thrust his spear into the Jordan and leap behind them being Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan then says to Resh Lakish, "Your strength is of an ox." Resh Lakish says back, "Your beauty of women." And the key here is that they use the word "looked like," not a different construction, which means dressed up as or appeared in the guise of, okay? And I'm going to move forward because I realize that, unfortunately, time is short. And I want to point out that I think the main important thing I want to point out is that I am using a version of the story that scholars prefer to not use. Scholars prefer to use a manuscript that makes this into a comedy of errors, where Resh Lakish sees Rabbi Yochanan and thinks they were a woman. And I use a manuscript which is shorter and weirder and less pious and less funny, that simply has Rabbi Yochanan look like a woman and be then praised as having the beauty of a woman. So there's no good philological reason to not choose the version of the manuscript that I use. And scholars using this other version of the story come up again with these words like effeminate, comedy of errors, mistaken identity, confused identity, homoerotic, and queer, where queer and homoeroticism is used to preserve the cisness and the binary of Rabbi Yochanan and the binary sex system, right? So I'm actually going to split this, which is basically trying to show you that sex gender is racialized. That is, while Rabbi Yochanan's lack of facial glory is a mark of beauty, it is a source of mockery when rabbis describe non-Jews who are eunuchs as beardless. And women who are not Jewish have hairy bodies, whereas Israelite women do not even produce hair on their armpits or groins. So there's a sort of, I would call it a proto-racializing dynamic. And now I'm going to sort of move to the end, which is the true trans part of the, in a way I'm trying to say there is no cisness, there is no binary sex gender. But the more obvious heavy-handed part of this is seeing someone's sex-gender transformation, and that is Shimon ben Lakish, who comes to attack, I think, and sexually predate upon Rabbi Yochanan, thrusting his spear into the Jordan, leaping behind him. And Yochanan describes him in response as having the strength of an ox, which a pious later hand strikes out and changes to the word Torah. The word for ox is Turah, the word for Torah is Oraita. And surprise, surprise, the manuscript that most people use in the printed edition has Yochanan praising Resh Lakish's strength as directed towards Torah, as they are being attacked, right? Clearly sexually attacked or by Resh Lakish. The story continues with what I see as a marriage proposal. That is, Shimon says to Yochanan, your beauty is of women, which could be your beauty is of wives. And Yochanan makes a deal, and we're almost closing here. Yochanan says to Shimon, if you retract yourself, you can translate this as if you repent. And guess what people prefer to translate it as? Repent. But it's very plainly a story about a spear being thrust and going behind, right? If you retract yourself, I have a sister more beautiful than me whom I will bring to you. And this exact formulation is used in a different case where a woman is, enslaved Jewish woman is trying to avoid having sex with a client when she's working in a brothel. Shimon agrees and retracts himself and tries to grab their weapon. The word money can mean weapon. It clearly has phallic allusions. It can also mean ox halter, but they can't, right? They try to grab their weapon, but they can't. They can't find it, right? As it says about Joseph, there's no man at home. Then Yochanan, using causative words, inscriptured and enmishned Shimon and transformed Shimon into a rabbi man. It's my heavy-handed translation of Gavra Rabbah, which could be big man, but Rabbah can mean big man, or it can mean rabbi, a rabbi man. And so I will end by asking, what does it mean to be transformed by someone into a rabbi man? Oops. And I would like to show you the scribal correction here in the manuscript I use. So what we see is Chelach Letura. Yochanan is saying to Resh Lakish, who is trying to attack them, your strength, your vigor is like that of an ox. And a later scribe strikes out the word ox and substitutes the word Torah. And essentially, right, that is the sex-gender transformation. Right, so it's kind of poignant. And what we have is a source that explains what it means to be a rabbi man. It is a source that exegetes a verse from Proverbs that says, I will name you men. And Rabbi Barachia says, these are Torah scholars who look like women and who perform strength, gevurah, like men. So what we have here is a conception of rabbinic sex gender that is profoundly non-essentialist and arguably bears no relationship to contemporary modern understandings of binary sex. The Torah scholar sex gender sounds a bit like Yochanan. The rabbi man is called a man. It's a matter of nomenclature, it's conventional. That person looks like a woman. Sound familiar? And at the same time, they perform strength like men. Their manliness is like men. Gender here is like all the way down. Gender is simile all the way down. This is not an account of transhistorical biological male sex. To be a Talmid Chacham is to look like a woman, and there is no essence of man. It's to try to be like a man in certain ways. Recall androgynous people who are like men, like women, also unlike men and women, right? And in a certain sense, my argument is that sex gender is always like, right? Sex gender is founded on relationships of likeness and difference, of action and performance, within complex matrix of ritual, obligation, and entitlement. And sex gender is more plenty than the anemic and recent conceit of the number two, men and women. Thanks.